my curious cats, and welcome to another episode of the Say SIKEology Podcast, the podcast for all the info on psychology's most questionable history. I'm your host, Leslie Lopez, PhD student and psychology nerd. Okay, so this week we are wrapping up our Project MKUltra Trilogy by taking a closer look at their final, or at least officially known to be their final, trajectory into the quest for mind control through the use of LSD. If you haven't listened to the last two episodes, Project Artichoke and Project MKUltra, I highly suggest you go back and do so because they kind of preface into this week's episode. This week, we're looking at Operation Midnight Climax, an upgraded version of Project MKUltra that aimed to crack the code on mind control once and for all through the use of LSD and sex. So if you're a little bit insane in the membrane like me, get cozy tozy and let's jump into it. Last week, we discussed the implications at the heart of Project MKUltra, which included a New York City safe house, the use of LSD on non-consenting adults, and the murder-suicide of Dr. Frank Olson. I'm sure we all remember our main man, Dr. Sidney Gottlieb. He's essentially the man who coined the idea of using LSD for mind control all throughout the 1950s. As we also learned last week, Dr. Gottlieb had a very loyal right-hand man by the name of Dr. George White. White was extremely loyal to Gottlieb in the Project MKUltra team, so much so that when he was offered a higher paying position by the Federal Bureau of Narcotics in San Francisco, he hesitated to take the job because he feared that it would strip him away from working with Gottlieb and Project MKUltra. But White was lucky enough to have a bestie as considerate and as loyal as Gottlieb because Gottlieb encouraged him to take the job in San Francisco. And that way, they could open a second safe house in San Francisco to further test Project MKUltra experimentations. See, Gottlieb noticed that at the New York City safe house, they weren't making much progress, at all. So Gottlieb saw this as the perfect opportunity to even further the experimentation. So when White arrived in San Francisco, he opened up a new safe house under Gottlieb's supervision, just as Gottlieb had told him to. Everything was to be handled the same way as it was back in the New York City safe house, except for a small added element. Because the whole point of Project MKUltra was using LSD on the enemy for mind control to get them to spill their secrets, but that hadn't gone them very far thus far. So Gottlieb wanted to see if he could loosen a man's tongue once sex was introduced into the equation. For science and national security, of course. USA, USA. Which, let's be honest, pill talk alone can get a man to spill virtually anything. In this case, the LSD would just be an added bonus, let's be honest. But, just like that, the San Francisco CIA safe house turned into the San Francisco CIA brothel, and Project MKUltra gave birth to a new sub-project by the name of Operation Midnight Climax. Once the San Francisco safe house was officially up and running under Gottlieb and the CIA's discretion, White's first task was to assemble a team of sex workers who would be willing to work under the CIA payroll but could be trusted by the CIA to do what needed to be done. Which, honestly, good for the sex workers. If that was me, I would have jumped at the opportunity, and I'm not even ashamed to say it. So, good for them. One thing about Operation Midnight Climax is that Gottlieb and his team knew that men who are relatively successful in their field and in their careers wouldn't follow just any sex worker back to their place of work. These type of men that Gottlieb and White were targeting typically went for the higher class girls, if you know what I mean. So the CIA had to ensure they were careful not only with who they hired, but also that the safe house gave these men a sense of luxury, just enough for them to stay. The pad is what they referred to as the San Francisco safe house. It was this L-shaped condo/loft building overlooking the San Francisco Bay, which was quite the upgrade compared to the New York City safe house where their target was felons and petty criminals, which, makes sense. You're not going to wine and dine with a gorgeous woman when the only thing on the table is involuntary drug usage. Also, of course, much like the New York City safe house, this place was wired up the yin-yang, if you know what I mean. It's said that if you so much as spilled a glass of water, you could potentially have been electrocuted. But the CIA was very creative with their decor, to say the least. The gracious amounts of wiring were all concealed by pornographic paintings and sculptures on the walls, the ceilings. Pretty much every nook and cranny in this place had some kind of sexual innuendo to it. Given that the type of men that they aimed to lure back to the pad, you would imagine that these pieces would be tasteful and expensive, but if there's one thing about classy businessmen, is that they are some of the biggest freaks behind closed doors, okay? And Gottlieb and his team knew this, probably from personal experience, let's be honest. It's said that inside the pad, you'd find the most vulgar pieces of artwork you could think of. Drawers all over the place were piled with every single sex toy you could imagine. Shelves were stacked with pornographic videos and magazines. Oh, and obviously we can't forget about the minibar, which was always stocked with just the best. Now, that sounds like a weekend retreat if you ask me. And if you listened to last week's episode, you know what I'm talking about. As for the sex workers, they were on a CIA payroll for the cooperation in the experiment. And as an added bonus, each woman was giving a stipend of about $50 to $100 for each unwilling lab rat that they managed to trap and bring back to the pad, which is equivalent to about $650 to $1,300 today. They were also given a get-out-of-jail-free card that they were able to use whenever they were to get in trouble with the local police while under Gottlieb's orders. Again, I have no shame in saying that I would totally have jumped at the opportunity if I were in their position. And I know a lot of you would too, don't lie. So, I'm not sure if you caught that last part, but these ladies were basically in charge of the whole operation. Yes, it was under the CIA's orders, but they were doing all the dirty work. No pun intended. One of many actually cringe things about all of this is that the sex workers knew they were being watched the whole time. And by the whole time, I mean the whole time. The watcher, if you will, was none other than White himself. He had built himself a small closet-like room in a little corner that consisted of a one-way mirror, a portable toilet, and surveillance equipment where he would sit and take notes while sipping on a martini. Like, honestly, what a perv. Like, this isn't even about science and national security anymore. These guys are just living out their sick little twisted fantasies of watching people get high off drugs and getting it on. Just, ugh. Back at the pad, the women either offered their man drugs or they would slip them into his drink without him knowing. Which, honestly, I wonder what it must have felt like for these women to be on the other side, not having to be the ones to cover their drink for once. Once the men were nice and comfy off LSD and a boner, the ladies got to doing their job. Once they were done having sex, the ladies were instructed to stay and engage in pillow talk with the clients. They found that when the sex workers showed interest in the men's lives, it gave them, the men, a boost of confidence that made him more willing to talk and spill secrets, both personal and professional. Which this makes complete sense given that the feeling of confidence lights up the orbital frontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for emotional decision making. In fact, it's shown through studies with rats that when self-confidence is impaired, so is decision making. And this was exactly what Gottlieb and his team were wanting to achieve for the entirety of the 4 years that Project MKUltra had been running. Who knew that all men needed to talk was an orgasm and to feel appreciated? Congratulations, CIA. You've discovered post-nut clarity. Needless to say, Gottlieb, White, and the rest of the CIA were very satisfied with the results of Operation Midnight Climax. So much so that a year into the operation, Gottlieb went ahead and opened a second pad in Marin County. If you thought things were crazy as it was, buckle up because they're about to get even crazier, if that's even possible. With the new pad, Gottlieb decided LSD was getting a little redundant, so he began concocting all types of synthetic drugs into the program, some of which the CIA ops were too scared to try out themselves. Not only that, but Gottlieb wanted to see what would happen if an entire room of horny individuals were dosed with LSD. That's right, you heard that right. Gottlieb wanted to see an old-fashioned orgy. Love that for him. Okay, so get this. Gottlieb actually went through with his little orgy experiment. He placed the drugs in an aerosol can and had them go through like a vent. But this was unsuccessful because the one time he did it, they had left a window open on a windy day. So the drugs just kind of like flew out the window. Talk about bad luck. But also for some scholarly CIA ops, not so quick with the thinking there, huh? Unsurprisingly, Gottlieb was getting way more than a science experiment worth out of Operation Midnight Climax. At the time, he lived in Maryland but was making very frequent trips to San Francisco. For business, of course. As you could guess, these trips were anything but business, though. Gottlieb was fully taking advantage of the endless supply of drugs and sex workers for himself, despite being married, by the way. So much so that it appeared as if he had lost sight of the whole point of the project in the first place, which, if you remember, was to defeat the Soviets, combat communism, and take back America. But he was a little distracted at the time. One CIA op was even quoted saying, "All Gottlieb wanted me to do was get him laid." Okay, like side note, Operation Midnight Climax wasn't even the only sub-project that Gottlieb had at the moment, and they were all equally corrupt. These sub-projects included testing on prisoners in exchange for provisions, better cells, new prison jobs, shorter sentences, and just more privileges inside the prison overall. More often than not, the prisoners weren't even told what drugs they were being given, but they complied nonetheless because the bribery was just too good to pass up. Okay, but back to our boy Gottlieb. His life and his career were slowly starting to spiral. He had essentially accomplished nothing, poisoned thousands, and was nowhere close to reaching his goal. In 1960, 9 years after the very beginning of Project MKUltra with Project Bluebird, Gottlieb drafted a memo where he admitted to wanting to give up on the project of ever getting to the root of mind control. His report stated that no effective knockout pill, truth serum, aphrodisiac, or recruitment pill ever existed. Gottlieb had to sadly admit to himself that his operation had been done in vain. In 1961, as the CIA saw that Gottlieb's work was getting nowhere, the government began to drastically cut back funding on Project MKUltra and all its sub-projects. With that, the LSD experiments slowly started to fade away, and by 1966, all of Gottlieb's safe houses were shut down for good. After a total of 15 unsuccessful and unethical years, Gottlieb had completely given up on his work and walked away. If the Soviets had actually perfected mind control, they had done a really good job at keeping their methods, and their minds locked away for no one else to figure out. Because especially people like Gottlieb, who after all those years of effort got nowhere close to cracking the code, it must have been just top-notch gatekeeping. After Gottlieb had admitted to the CIA of his failures, he managed to convince them to keep all the files and information highly classified and only available to those with top-secret clearance. I wonder why. The CIA reluctantly agreed, stating that it was the government's best interest to comply with these demands. I mean, after all, the damage that was done probably wouldn't make them look good in the public's eye. Gee, you think? I mean, we're here, aren't we? Although, believe it or not, at the time, the CIA wasn't fully aware of the complete damage that Project MKUltra had caused across the spectrum over the last 15 years. Well, like, what? Like, what do you mean they didn't know? Okay, they were only aware of what Gottlieb had led them to know, apparently. So after the project was officially finished, the CIA went and did their own investigating on the complete damage that had entailed. The CIA sensed that Gottlieb was hiding more than he had let on, and they were going to find out what and why. In 1974, the CIA ops began to see the truth behind Gottlieb's spying of everyday citizens, and in 1975, Frank Olson's family came out saying that there was more to his death than Gottlieb and his team had led them to believe in the early 1950s. Gottlieb's secrets were slowly coming to light and were being exposed to the CIA and soon to the American public. In 1975, Gottlieb received news that he was under investigation. Gottlieb agreed to be fully cooperative with the project's MKUltra investigations and in return received immunity from any criminal acts found under his name. With that immunity, he confessed to crimes from Camp King to the LSD to the safe houses, everything. In court, every witness who took the stand spoke with "I don't know" and "I don't remember" language. Obviously, they were all finely coached. Gottlieb and his team made sure their involvement was all covered up. They meticulously destroyed hundreds of thousands of materials that were related to the project, and any charges that could have been brought against the project or its supervisor slowly faded into oblivion, and Gottlieb was able to walk away without a single stain to his record. However, one thing that ultimately remains a mystery to this day is Frank Olson's death. But that's a rabbit hole I will not be going down on this podcast. But if you're a curious cat like me, I totally invite you to check it out. It'll keep you up at night. Believe me. Well, my curious cats, thank you so much for tuning in to this week's episode and the finale of our Project MKUltra Trilogy. Let me know down in the comments your thoughts on the whole thing. There's so much more to unpack if I'm being honest, but most of it is all conspiracy theories that will indefinitely fuck up your sleeping schedule. Believe me, I'm speaking from experience. But if you enjoyed this week's episode, please remember to like, subscribe, and follow the podcast on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Remember to follow the podcast on Instagram at the Say SIKEology Podcast for news and episode updates. As well, citations will be in the description if you want to check those out. Stay blessed, stay sane, and stay psyched. I love you. Bye.